Okay, I think we can kind of get started now, and then anyone that jumps in can just catch up when they get in. So yeah, welcome everybody. We're delighted that you're able to join us today for our fourth webinar of 2024. At the NFB, we pride ourselves in keeping our members up to date with the latest news and developments, policy updates, so that you're able to be competent and up to date, with all the information to help you run your successful businesses. So today, we're pleased to say that we've got our net zero and sustainability advisors as our presenters. So with Net Zero International provide help and advice for NFB members and are also responsible for the NFB carbon dashboard that some of you may be using within your businesses. So presenting today, we've got co-founders David Hayes. Give us a wave, David, so everyone knows who you are, who's the CEO, and then Chris Williams, the is it CCO? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Mia.
So many acronyms, it's just difficult to get them right. So they're going to be presenting today and answering any questions that you have in our webinar. We've also got NFB member Simon Gerlin joining us today, who's going to be sharing some of his experiences of net zero and his kind of best practice and that kind of thing. So yeah, without further ado, we've got Navigating Your Way to Net Zero webinar today. And just to let you know, before we get started, the webinar is being recorded. So any NFB members will be able to view this in the members area shortly after the presentation. And can I ask that if you do have any questions, just pop them over in the Q&A box in the chat. There's a Q&A icon down at the bottom there, and David and Chris will be happy to answer them at the end of their presentation. So I will hand over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Mia. Yeah, morning, everybody. Great to see everyone, and thank you very much for joining the call. As Mia said, my name is David Hawes. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Net Zero International. I'm going to give you a sort of 15-20 minute overview, really, of what Net Zero is about and how it affects your business. But let me just give a quick overview of Net Zero International. So we are a net zero solutions business, and we offer what we call carbon AAA. So we do carbon accounting. We have a software solutions partner that we use, and we embed carbon accounting into the businesses we work with. So that's getting the data, working out the emissions, and providing information around what to measure as well in the future. We also provide carbon accreditation. So we do all reports that we write are to SECR standard. I'll get into what SECR means a bit later in the call for those who don't understand, but basically all the reports that we do are to all current legislative and regulatory requirements, including for tenders that are probably quite important to a lot of businesses on this call today. So yeah, our carbon report is done to those standards. And then we also offer advice. So we offer advice from a sort of what's practical to measure, how's it best to measure it, what's best to go for in terms of reduction, all the way through to advice around the regulatory and the landscape of what's likely to come through legislation in the future. And then we also support businesses with larger sort of scale strategy, because at the heart of net zero is transition within your business to look to decarbonize over a long period of time. We also do CPD accredited training, and we offer supply solutions. So that's really working with larger organizations around the supply chains. So businesses large and small. Smallest business has got 6 staff, need to do a carbon reduction plan because they're a team of architects and have to do it for some of the London universities. Our largest business, 25,000, and we do a lot of work with them around things like SBTI verifications, training of their senior board, and strategy around the supply chain, because they've got about 3,500 suppliers. Also, some of you may not aware, but the carbon accounting industry is not currently regulated or legislated for. So I can't show you my carbon accounting qualifications because they don't currently exist. So we are founding members of what's called the Carbon Accounting Alliance. There's about 200 or 300 businesses now that have joined that alliance, and we are looking to professionalize and standardize our industry. As the demand for what we provide obviously increases, we need to make sure that it's done to the right standards. And so there's quite a lot of noise around net zero and carbon accounting. I'm sure many people are aware. So we're currently working with government around creating some legislation and regulatory sort of standards, and also around frameworks to get qualifications and training done. So that's really quite an exciting part of what we're doing. As I say, we look to professionalize our industry, and there's our website if anyone wants to go in and have a look. So that's a bit about us. So what we're going to cover today, first question sort of normally asked is what is net zero, and making sure people understand it. You hear it's probably a phrase you hear a lot, but people may not understand the sort of technical terms. So let's get into a bit of detail firstly about climate change. So you can see here, this is a pretty famous graph called the hockey stick graph. And this shows the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And you can see it was a pretty flat line all the way up to sort of the late 1880s. And the 1880s was when we started to sort of burn fossil fuels, in essence, as we went through the Industrial Revolution. And as you can see, since then, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has sort of, exponentially increased up to where it's now at its highest levels and continues to increase as well. Now, the issue with that is that and I'm not a scientist, by the way, I should have said that, as the amount of carbon dioxide and other equivalent gases are in the atmosphere, it means the heat from the planet doesn't rise, and therefore it sort of gets maintained. And that means that the average temperature increases, hence it's called a greenhouse gas. And we are currently at about 1.2 degrees above, maybe probably nearer 1.3 now, above where we were at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And just to put in context, for every 1 degree of temperature rise, that displaces about a billion people. And also, interestingly, adds about 7% more moisture in the atmosphere. So when you see that there are sort of biblical type floods in Dubai, currently in Kenya, Tanzania, the reason that when it rains now, you get more rain is because there's more water in the atmosphere because of the temperature rise. So these are some of the consequences of climate change. And the next slide shows you some of those consequences. I'm not saying, and nobody is saying in our industry, that climate change affects all these. We've always had weather events, that will always happen. But what we do know categorically is that through climate change, the impact of events is becoming greater, and also the frequency of events coming greater. So we're starting to get sort of once in generation events annually in certain places of the world. Now, just to put it in context, we're at 1.2 to 3 degrees above the Industrial Revolution sort of temperature. Across the equator, that's about 2 to 2.5% degrees. So some places now around the world are becoming inhabitable. I'm going to say that properly. Uninhabitable, because you can't grow things, too hot to live, can't get water. So that is what leads to that population displacement. The other one I wanted to flag, I won't go through all of them, but if you look at the flooding issue, if you look at Bangladesh, for example, about 500,000 people are being displaced from coastal areas inland every year in Bangladesh currently because of sea rise level, to the point where Dakar is now almost one of the most overly populated countries in the world. So what net zero is the world's solution to tackling climate change and coming up with a way that we can reduce the amount of emissions that we are emitting into the atmosphere that are making the temperature rise that then cause these issues. And what net zero is, and again, is to just give a sort of bit of perspective, is people may have heard of the Paris Agreement. So it's quite a famous sort of COP21 back in 2015. Paris Agreement was signed by all countries, by about 7 or 8, to say that we wanted to keep the world global temperature to no more than 2 degrees, and ideally 1.5 degrees from the pre-industrial levels by 2100. So you might hear this sort of 1.5 degrees temperature being mentioned quite a lot. And the reason for that is because 1.5 degrees is at a point where after that or over that, some of those worst consequences become sort of significantly worse. So that's why 1.5 degrees is talked about a lot. And the way you measure that is through something called science-based targets. And what the science-based targets say is we need to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030, and to get to net zero by 2050, ideally. And I'll explain what net zero is in a second. And just to put that in context as well, the UK back in 2019, so that was under Theresa May's government, actually enshrined net zero into law. So we are legally bound to be a net zero country by 2050, and which means, in essence, if you are not net zero by business by 2050, you will not be able to trade. Now, how that works and mechanism, no one yet knows, but that is the legal position. Every country has to update. They go to the COP annual COP meetings, and every country has to update at those COP meetings what they are doing about reducing emissions. That used to be every 5 years. That was the Paris Agreement. That it was a 5 year cycle. But because actually we've seen quite an increase in temperatures over the last couple of years, that's now an annual cycle. So every year at every COP, every country has to come up with what it's going to do to get on track to get to net zero. And that's why you'll see legislation, regulation becoming increasingly stricter. Now, obviously, in the UK, an example of that would be that there was a ban on new sales of diesel and petrol cars from 2030. That was put to 2035 by the government back in September. But net zero has now become a bit of a sort of political football for various reasons, which is unfortunate, and hopefully that will become a bit sort of better. But I do think over the next few months we'll probably see a little bit of that as we move into an election phase. But all parties are signed up to net zero by 2050. In Scotland, it's still 2045, depending on despite some of the announcements that were made last week about some of their targets. So what that also means is that the governments are going to have to do it through a carrot and a stick. So carrot should be through better rates for people that are reducing their emissions, through maybe reducing VAT on certain elements that are recycled, and maybe better payment terms and grants. But we're also likely to see a carbon tax of some description. So we've already seen that come in for steel, a fertilizer, concrete, some of the higher emitting things, through something called CBAM. Doesn't come into this country till 2026, but we are likely to see more taxation on things that emit more emissions over time. So this is also a good idea to get on track and reduce your emissions now, because you're going to save money in the future when that tax comes about. So ultimately, you're going to have to do this because it's right for your business. So again, the question was, what is net zero? This is the definition of what net zero is. So net zero is about reducing your emissions in line with the science-based targets, which means reducing your emissions by 50% by 2030 and by 90% at the least by 2050, and then offsetting the last bit of your emissions, so the last 10% ideally. So this is the science-based way of us reducing our emissions worldwide to make sure that we can keep 1.5 degree temperature. They call it keep 1.5 alive. At the moment, actually, I've got a later slide. Let me show that later. But offsetting should only really be done at the very end. You should concentrate on a net zero reduction strategy and then offset the final bit rather than offset. That's a much better approach to it. You can pay for offsets, of course, if you want to, and strategically you may decide that. But generally, with our client base, we will always talk about mitigation and reduction first rather than offsetting. Now, you may have heard of other phrases, carbon neutral, carbon negative, etc. And I'm just going to explain the difference between those on the next slide. So net zero, as I say, is, sorry, this is a slide that builds. So Jackie, you have to keep clicking for me as I talk. Sorry. So net zero, as I mentioned, is a 90% reduction by 2050 as a minimum, and then offsetting that final 10%. Carbon neutral would be where let's say you reduce your emissions by 50%, and then you decide to offset your other 50% of emissions through some form of offsetting program. So it might be that you decide to plant trees, it might be you decide to invest in solar stoves or other projects. So let's just use this company as an example. Let's say they've got 100 tons in their business of emissions. They get to 90 ton reduction by 2050 and offset the last 10. This company could, let's say at 2030, get to reducing their emissions by 50%. So they've got 50 tons. They then offset their 50 tons left. They can say they're carbon neutral. We don't talk about carbon neutral. We only talk about net zero as a business. Carbon neutral is becoming an increasingly not unliked term, because there is a lot around businesses not needing to actually reduce but offsetting, and we won't be able to sort of get to 1.5 if we do that, to the point where the EU have now banned carbon neutral as for any form of advertising or any form of sort of statement in businesses. They put that into effect a couple of months ago, and it will come fully to effect within 2 years. So increasingly, carbon neutral is a phrase that won't be sort of allowed. There is a big issue with carbon neutral, and I haven't got time to get into detail about it, but I'm happy to talk to anyone about it. But net zero transition is what you want to aim for. It's a much better approach to it. You will then also see some companies say that they are carbon positive stroke negative. Now, what this means is that, let's say this company got to 50 tons emissions by 2030, and then let's say by 2040 they get to 30 tons emissions. So they've reduced it further, but they continue to offset those 50 tons of carbon. What they are saying is that they are carbon positive or negative. Now, carbon positive and negative actually means the same. It's just some companies don't like the word negative when they talk about things. They prefer to say carbon positive. In essence, any business that tells you they are carbon positive stroke negative is in essence saying if they didn't exist as a business, there would be more carbon in the atmosphere. And frankly, I find that very difficult to believe with lots of claims. The Green Claims Code, which is a new sort of standard that's been brought in by the Conduct and Market Authority, will start to stop some of the claims that are coming to be done. There are a couple of a specific example. There's one really good rum distiller that are carbon negative, they call it. They do it the right way, and that's because of the way they sequester carbon through their processes. So, I could confirm them. So if you like a drop of rum, you can have a drop of rum and also think you're doing something good for the planet, So, but there are very, very few businesses out there that are genuinely taking more carbon out of the atmosphere than they're putting in. So yeah, they're the difference between the terms. But say definitely we talk about a net zero strategy and not a carbon neutral strategy. That's really important to re-emphasize. So they're the different positions. And I mentioned a minute ago about where we are from a sort of a global perspective. So this is something called the Climate Action Tracker, which is really, really good. If anyone is interested, you can go in, you can look at literally every single country's NDCs, you can look at what they're going to do about it, you can see whether they're on track. It's really, really good for if anyone is interested. But what this tells us is there's 4 different points here. You've got the most optimistic scenario, and what the optimistic scenario is that every single NDC that every country has produced, they actually deliver all new technologies that we think will happen, will deliver on time. Everything will basically happen to the best scenario, means we are likely to end up at a 1.8 degree temperature rise. If you look at the actual pledges and targets that have been made, so this is based on the 2030 NDC targets that all the countries have submitted. It's 2.1 degree rise, and obviously there's always going to be a scope, but let's go with the median here, 2.1. If you look at the 2030 only target, so this is countries based on what they say they're going to do by 2030, we're at 2.5 degree temperature rise. And then if you look at actually what's happening around policies around the world, we're looking at a 2.7 degree temperature rise. So even on the best case scenario, we're still going to breach 1.5 degrees. And I mentioned earlier the consequences of obviously, the planet warming and the consequences I have. So that's why you'll see a lot of people talking about we need more action, we need to go faster, because ultimately at the current path, we are going to be significantly over the 2 degrees. I think 1.5 is probably, if I'm honest, probably not going to be achievable. Most people now agree with that. But, keeping it below 2 and to that 1.8 is obviously the best case scenario. A lot of people say about the COP meetings, are they worth doing? When the first sort of COP meeting started to happen, the original projections were about a 4.5 degree temperature rise. So there has been improvement. It has reduced the number, but it's still not fast enough for the to stop some of those worst consequences that we talked about. So yeah, that's where we're currently at, and that's why we are convinced that legislation regulation will continue to increase, because we are so off track of where we need to be. And so I'm not just talking in a UK perspective, I'm talking globally here. So this looks a really busy slide, but I'm going to cover it quite quickly because just wanted to talk about how policy works. So we have this international sort of policy. So you've lots of acronyms. I apologize. I'll whiz through them quite quickly. So you've got the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the sort of the convention that then pulls together the COP summit. So that's the international agreement about how we deal with climate change. And this has been sort of set up since the early 90s. We have then the Independent Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, sorry, and that is the scientists. So there's about 2,500 scientists worldwide that will liaise, work together, and they're the people who basically are telling us where they see temperature going based on current science. And if you look at anything that they're telling us, we're in a particularly bad patch at the moment. We're well above the 1.5 as a rolling 12 months. We've had something called El Nino. World ocean temperatures are warmer than they've ever been, so we're in quite a difficult time at the moment from a scientific perspective, and so you're seeing some of the consequences of that. NDCs I've already mentioned, which is the country's sort of commitments, and then the SDGs are the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's also created by the UN. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and if you have to do a broader sort of tender around not just net zero but around sustainability, you may be asked to look at things like the Sustainable Development Goals and tie them in. And again, we can advise around that. It's not our specialism, but we are aware of the SDGs, and we do tie some areas into that if you've got a sustainability requirement. And then the CSRD is the Corporate Social Responsibility Directive in Europe. That's around larger organizations now having to start to report. The reason I've put that in is because it is likely to come into the UK at some point. We generally do flow and follow with the EU. And then in the UK, we've got net zero by 2050 is legally binding. As I mentioned, in Scotland, it's 2045. We have a net zero strategy published. There are about 600 actions the government need to do through that strategy. And we also have something called the Committee on Climate Change. So the Climate Change Committee. So the Climate Change Committee is an independent committee that holds government's feet to the fire and will tell us whether the government is doing the right or the wrong things. And they were quite vocal last week with the announcement in Scotland about their net zero targets. Their chief executives literally just left this week, so they've been in the news quite a bit. But they are an independent sort of body that sits and tells us whether the UK is on track or not to deliver. And what they say is, out of those 600 actions that the UK government have committed to through their strategy, about 38% are on track. So we are slightly off track. And what that means is the UK government has been taken to court to say that it's not potentially going to achieve its 2050 targets. And that's been taken to court by sort of Greenpeace and Climate Earth and people like that. That's currently going through a second reading at the moment. They lost the first case and it's currently gone back in. Probably more relevant for businesses on this call is what you have to report. So any business that has over 250 staff, turns over more than 35 million, has 18 million assets, two of those three has to report their carbon as part of their annual accounts. It's called an SECR, and that's what we do. And the report we write with any business we work with is SECR compliant, because ultimately all companies will have to report their carbon in some way. So the way we work is we work with everyone in that space ready for when that happens. And then again, TPN 0621 is something you may have heard of. That's the government's procurement policy, public procurement notice around having a carbon reduction plan if you want to go for any government tender over £5 million. You have to have a report that aligns to PPN 0621, and all our reporting does. In the NHS, that's now all contracts, not even just over 5 million. So from April, if you want to do an NHS contract, you have to have a PPN 0621 compliant carbon report. The TCFD is around the risk of climate change. So there's two things there. There's the risk of climate change on your business from a physical perspective. So physical risk of, more rain, hotter days, potentially more wind events, might be risks to your business of the supply chain you use. If you get things from a factory that's in a area placed prone to flooding, for example. So there's this sort of risk of physical issues on your business, but there's also the risk of climate change policy on your business. So again, if you're not thinking about how you are going to decarbonize your organization, you potentially won't win contracts in the future if you don't have a PPNO 621 compliant report. If they reduce the amount of emissions that you can have per square meter of build, then again, there's an issue for you if you can't measure it. So there could be a risk to your business of the policies and legislation that comes in. So you have to think about it from that perspective. And the sustainable disclosure standards, I won't go through those today, or the TPT, because they in essence are covered by that. This is just a general slide we use. And then I've talked already about 2050 reduction, say 78% reduction by 2035, and the fact that if any of you do work in Scotland, it is a 2045 target there. I think that the next slide is to talk about the NHS, if I remember rightly. Yeah, so this is the NHS. I just mentioned this and I just thought I'd cover this. So you can see the NHS's sort of roadmap to get to net zero, something called Evergreen. They have an online portal, which you may be asked to complete. And again, we can help you do that. We do that. And we worked with the NHS on Evergreen, and we gave some feedback when they did the initial trial with some of our clients. But you can see there that April 24, is probably a big point where it says the NHS will extend its requirement to all procurements. And then also from April 2027, so what's that, 36 months away, all suppliers will need to publicly report all their targets. So not just for scope 1, 2, and certain elements of scope 3, but all elements. And I'm going to cover that in the next section about what that means. And then eventually, so sort of we've been saying 50 months, but it's now 48 months away, any product you supply to NHS has to have a carbon footprint of that particular product. So if you did a building or a rebuild or a refurb for the NHS, you would have to be able to give the carbon of that particular project to the NHS. Every single item they buy, they want to have that. That's being worked on at the moment, but they're very, very keen to push that through. And that isn't that long away, which is why having this strategy in place now and transition in place now is really important. Right, so I'm gonna pause there, and we're going to talk about how you carbon account. But what I'm going to do now is introduce you to Simon from SEH French. And Simon, you're right to give just a bit of overview from your experience, please.
Yes, thanks, David.
Thank you.
Morning, everyone. Just to give you a bit of a brief overview, Simon Gerling from SEH French. We are a medium-sized main contractor. We turn over between sort of 15-20 million pound a year, and we've started on our carbon journey, I suppose you can call it, probably back in 2022. Mainly through the demands of our clients. We're a member of 10 frameworks, and we are getting a lot, and a lot of them are public frameworks. And we were getting a lot of demands from our clients to report our carbon footprint. So we started off in 2022 to report retrospectively for 2021, and we went with an organization who we provided them with the very limited data that we had available for them to produce our first sort of baseline carbon reduction plan, and that worked very well. It provided us, it sort of ticked the boxes of what we needed at that moment in time for our clients to say that we are aware of our impact on what we're doing, and what the business is doing and with carbon, but we didn't really fully understand it, to be perfectly honest. Then we started working with Net Zero International in early 2023, and the approach was quite different in the sense that David and his team, they demystified a lot of the, shall we say, carbon terminology that we didn't fully understand, and we didn't appreciate how it impacted our business or how our operations impacted the business, and also with the carbon. Their approach for us was a lot more, I suppose, educational for us, that where previously we spent a long time getting the information to retrospectively report 2021 figures. Whilst we gave them to the organisation that did it prior to our involvement of Net Zero, as I say, that was a bit of a secret squirrel sort of attitude in some ways, that we gave them simply the figures, and then they went away and came back and give us our report. And so, as I say, it was great, but we didn't really understand it. Now, as an organisation, we want to take care of what we're doing with the environment and our impact on the environment, and so we wanted to understand it more. What interested us with net zero was the carbon calculator that helped us achieve that, working closely with David and his team, that we could get involved with producing everything that we needed, but also understand what else we needed to report on as regards to the different areas of our business, whether it's our fuel, whether it's our transport, whether it's all our energy usage, whether it's on our sites, whether it's in our head office. So we could understand a lot better on what we were doing. We did this a lot with David by using the carbon calculator. That also we achieved significant cost savings within, because we had our own admin team working hard and producing that information. But then again, working with David, we could understand what else we needed to do. So we then changed our approach on one or two areas of reports on sites, so we could get a better understanding. So we then report a lot more information in regards to travel for all our subcontractors, and whilst it's quite easy to do for our own guys, it's a lot more difficult with our subcontractors, which were 80% of our business. So whilst we were producing some reports, we knew there was a lot more that we weren't producing. So again, that's where it worked very well. So in 2023, we reported again retrospectively for 2022, met regularly with David on a monthly basis. Our admin team worked with him, inputting the information. We set up further changes to our business model internally, which didn't really cost as much money to introduce. It was just a different way of reporting, so we get a better idea of the impact of everything we do. And therefore it now means we're producing a lot more data, a lot more information, which is a lot more accurate with what we're doing. So we're changing. Last year we changed the baseline because we're now reporting a lot of our subcontractors, and which, as I say, is 80% of our business. So that report all their travel distances and things like that, which is we know and we identify through the carbon calculator, that's the biggest impact of our business. So that's where something that it's been quite an easy journey in some ways. That we started off quite concerned about it, quite not understanding everything, but working with net zero, it's proved to be quite a simple thing that we've worked with at sort of on a basis over the last couple of years. We're now reporting 2023. We reported on a live basis, so we're reporting every month on that, so we could understand things a lot more quicker and the impact we're doing. And we're now going into 2024 doing exactly the same thing. But we've also then again reduced the number of meetings we have with net zero, because we understand it all a lot better and we can input it. David and his team then top and tail everything we do to then verify and make sure we're doing everything correct and report that to us. So that is a big pro for us, reporting to our clients as well, that we can give them that information if they so wish, and that we have got a handle on it. We also know that we can set short and long-term targets as regards to how we want to improve things, and we also understand the impacts of the decisions, because we now know that, as David said, you can offset things, but we could spend a lot of money to, I don't know, change certain things in the company, but it only achieve the minor details regards to our carbon reduction. Or we could introduce something else which wouldn't cost much but actually save a lot. So that means we're a lot more informed and a lot more considered with the decisions we make. So it's been good in the last sort of journey. The team are now coming on, have been on board with it now, and that everyone's contributing to how else we can improve it by producing our reports. Everybody within the company and outside the company can see the reports and seeing how our journey is progressing. So we know we've got a long way to go, and we know that certainly organizations bigger than us, certainly our supply chains, we want to get more information with them, but we're now starting to have them conversations again to make sure we can report a lot more there. So it's been a really good journey. Working with Net Zero means we've provided what we need to our clients, but also it means we're educating ourselves, so then we get a better understanding to then produce that going forward. So it's been very well worthwhile.
Great.
That's it
Thanks,
from me.
Simon. Thanks, Simon. Very good. Yeah, and it's great working with you and your team. I think Simon, as Simon said, we really do like to partner with our clients. And that first year probably is more hand holding, and but we are a great believer in educating people and then partnering in the future, but with a much sort of lighter touch approach, or getting involved in tenders and bids. So thanks for that. Right, last sort of section is just really quickly, because people may not understand how you measure carbon. So this is the greenhouse gas protocol slide. So this is their sort of diagram of how you measure carbon. We've added the cradle to gate and gate to grave down the bottom, just try and, as I think Simon, we used the word, we tried to demystify a lot of this where possible, because it can be complicated. Our job is to take the heavy lifting in that respect and help you to understand it in a simple way as possible. So carbon's put into 3 different categories. I talk carbon, but obviously there are other greenhouse gases, and they're all along the top. So it includes methane, NOx, etc. But everything is put into CO2 equivalent for carbon accounting, because it's much simpler. 3 different scopes. So you've got scope 1, which is in essence the fuel you buy. So it's the fuel in your company vehicles. It's the gas you burn in your office if you have any. It would be fuel you buy for generators on site. It may be any refrigerants you use. It may be any air conditioning top ups. It may be anything around fuel that you buy and then you use or burn. So that would be your scope 1 emissions. And again, as Simon mentioned, you get that through your fuel records. So it could be mileage, it could be litres bought, it'll be kilowatt hours of gas you've used, it'll be litres of fuel you've bought for generators. You get that data, and there are carbon emissions factors for all different types of fuels, which we have, and they're all produced by the government. So for a kilowatt of hour of gas, it's about 0.1 kilogram of carbon, for example. And we've got the calculator that has all of that data in. We put that in, and that will tell you what your scope 1 emissions are. Scope 2 is the fuel that you buy. Sorry, fuel you burn is scope 1, fuel you buy is scope 2. Generally, that's electricity. So you're buying the electricity from the grid and you're using it. Again, that would be through your kilowatt hours usage, so your meter readings. You may generate your own if you've got solar and stuff like that, which is great, and we calculate all that with skill of scope 2, but it's much lower emission, if 0 emission at all. So scope 1 and scope 2 are generally relatively straightforward to get the data for, because you mostly know fuel, electricity, gas. You generally have good records for that. Scope 3 is much more complicated and much more difficult to measure. And you can see there's a lot of different categories in scope 3. So there's 15 categories of scope 3, 8 what we call upstream, 7 what we call downstream. Now, if I just focus on PPN 0621, that requires you to measure scope 1, scope 2, and 5 elements of scope 3. So that is transportation and distribution. So that's getting things to you. So that would be if you had a third-party supplier delivering all of your timber or your steel or whatever to you, not that you buy from the company, but you have a 3PL company, you would measure the emissions of that. The waste that you generate. So, maybe skips on site, it may be the food waste bin in your office. We'd measure how much waste you generate, and there are emissions of factors to that. Any business travel. So that's business travel that is not done by vehicles that you own as a company. So it might be someone in your business who goes on a business trip and claims it back through expenses. It might be trains, it might be planes, it might be ferries, buses, taxis, all the business travel you're doing. Again, most businesses have records of that, but maybe not the distances or travel. Maybe that'll be in spend. So part of your carbon reduction plan will be to get better data around business travel. And then the last upstream scope 3 one is employee commuting. So that's your staff getting to their normal place of work. And the way you do that is you do a survey of your staff, and then we'd extrapolate the data based on that survey. You're not expected to ask every member of staff every day how they travel, but you have to calculate that as well. So that's the upstream ones, and the downstream one would then be transportation and distribution. So that's getting your product to your customers. Again, that may be some shipping costs that you have and information. But there's also included in scope 3 everything you buy, everything you sell, a consequence of everything you sell. Your pension fund, for example, is one that people don't think about. So literally everything that all the carbon that exists because you are as an organization is included in scope 3, which is why we start with some of the easier ones to measure first and then put a plan in place to understand all of your scope 3 emissions over time. And bear in mind, the NHS, as I mentioned earlier, have given a 2027 deadline for all scope 3 emissions. So, you know, there is time to understand these things. Just to summarize that in a simple way is that scope 1 is the fuels you burn, as I mentioned. Scope 2 is the energy you buy. And then scope 3 is a consequence of everything you sell and everything you buy. And if you look at the percentages there, on average, most organizations, you'll see probably less than 20% is in scope 1 and 2. The vast majority of scope 3 sits in your, sorry, the vast majority of your emissions sit in scope 3. And a lot of that will sit down to the companies that supply you the product. So this will be a case of you starting to talk to your suppliers to provide the information and the carbon of the product or service that you buy from them, as you're starting to get asked by your customers what the emissions are, because carbon can sit on multiple businesses' balance sheets and on their carbon inventories. You'll see that quite a lot. Just thing to bear in mind is when companies say they are potentially carbon neutral or net zero now, they are probably only talking about scope 1 and 2. So you've got some claims at the moment where companies are saying they're carbon neutral, but they're only measuring maybe 10 or 20% of their carbon, which is why there needs to be some more firm action around the Green Claims Code to stop people from saying some of this stuff. SECR reporting, which is the mandatory reporting for large organisations, is only scope 1 and 2. So large organisations may only be measuring scope 1 and 2 and not really measuring all of scope 3. Now, I mentioned about where you sit. So as a business, you sit in that, let's say you sit in this middle chunk here. So don't forget your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions will sit on the balance sheet or the carbon intensity of your customer's scope 3. That's why they need to know it. And there's something called fair share, which I haven't got time to go into, but scope 3 sort of, you know, the way you divvy that up is being talked about at the moment and how we do that properly. But there's a massive independency between you and your customers and your suppliers. And the reason that's really important is because it means collaboration. So you collaborating with your customers and your suppliers to come up with lower carbon solutions is ultimately how we're going to fix some of the net zero challenges, is working together. So the old sort of days of, you know, competition and not sharing best practice really in this space isn't really relevant, because it's a bit of a cliche, but generally there is only one planet. So really we do need to work in much more collaborative approach to reduce emissions together and share our best practice. I think I've just got a couple of sort of summary slides and then we'll move to any questions. So just to reiterate, you know, net zero is about us mitigating the risk of climate change, and I've explained what they are. The fact that legislation regulation is changing and will increase as temperature increases. And, you know, we talk very much about strategic decisions around net zero. Not many of you will have a, you know, 26-year business plan, but ultimately net zero potentially is going to be that. So this is about sitting at the heart of the business strategy and making decisions that may not come into effect for 5 years. If you're going to change your fleet out, you may not want to do that till the mid 2030s. That's fine, but at least you can put it in your carbon reduction plan and you have it as part of your strategy. Just move on to the next. Yeah. So again, I'm one of those great believers that for every challenge you can reframe it as an opportunity, and I do believe this is a massive opportunity for innovation, say collaboration, just doing things better, leaving our kids a you know, better place than we sort of joined, you know, and all that sort of stuff. And working in collaboration with other organisations is critical for that. So you need to have that long-term thinking around this. And also, you know, we've got Simon here, which is great. You know, the best businesses we work with have got, you know, the owners, the runners of the business who absolutely believe this and understand that there is a really good commercial reason for doing this, as well as it being, you know, morally the right thing to do. But there is so much evidence that says that transitioning to net zero is good for business. And we work with you very much from a pragmatic, value-driven sort of sense, how we can make your business stronger. Ultimately, we want businesses that are lower carbon to win more work. And that's really important. And then there are all these other things around. You're, say, much more likely to recruit anybody, certainly younger people want to work for more sustainable businesses. You'll retain your business, your staff. You'll train your staff, as Simon said. You know, we've got new skills that have been added to some of his team, and I think it would be fair to say they quite enjoyed doing something different as well. You know, they've enjoyed learning and understanding, and we can help you that with businesses, you know, throughout. And also ultimately say it will reduce your costs, because at the heart of being sort of carbon efficient is being efficient, reducing waste, reducing mileages, you know, car sharing, whatever it may be. Ultimately, that will have a reduction in your spend. There may be some investment, you know, if you do want to switch to solar or something, there's investment. But over time, that will obviously pay off. Yeah, that's not bad for timing, I don't think. Yeah, so I think we've done all right. Just to put that in context, I've done that session in 4 hours before rather than 30 minutes, because there's a lot there. So I've tried to rattle through it pretty quickly, but thank you very much. Thanks, Mia.
No, excellent. Thank you very much, David. That was really insightful, and Simon as well. Well, I'll have a look at the Q&A box. We've got one question from Adrian Lewis, which is about net zero carbon in Wales. I don't know if, Adrian, are you able to elaborate slightly in the box about your question? Is there a target in Wales for net zero by 2030? I think he's put.
Yeah, so that's an interim target. That's similar to what I was talking about. So in the UK, it's 68% reduction by 2030. In Scotland, it was 75% reduction, and that's what they've sort of moved away from. But net zero, Wales is still 2050 in essence, but they have this reduction to get to net zero. Sort of, I don't know what the exact percentage is in Wales by 2030, but they won't be on track to achieve proper genuine net zero by 2030. No country in the world. I mean, the most ambitious countries are Sweden and Scotland. They're the only countries that have gone 2045. There's quite a lot of large organizations that have started to make a pledge to say they're going to get there by 2030. But I'll use Google, for example. Google won't be net zero, they'll be carbon neutral. And they've been very clear about that, because the emissions they emit, just because of what they do, you think of, you know, data centers and stuff like that. But they invest about $1 billion a year in solar farms around the world and stuff like that, you know. So net zero is still a bit of an unknown phrase, and I think that's something that we need to improve upon, if I'm honest with you.
And then we've got a message from Phil Connell saying, does the NFB have any guidance or common initiatives that construction businesses can learn from? For example, we know that mileage is our major source of emissions. We'd like to learn how other companies are addressing the challenges. Well, I think the NFB has, we're in, you know, constant communication with Net Zero and David and Chris. And I think we have examples and case studies, as you can see from Simon's experience, that you can see how this works and how it is positively impacting their businesses. In terms of, you know, if you'd like to learn more about how other companies are addressing the challenges, I guess the best people to speak to would be yourself, David and Chris. I think that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Could I jump in? Sorry.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, of course.
Sorry. It's certainly from our side, by producing the plans we've got, we know exactly where our major carbon output is, and it is on the travel, exactly as you say, Phil. Quite simple. I don't think it's a overly scientific answer. It is we need to get more commercial vehicles and to be electric, basically, which need to be more commercially available for us as organisations. So I think it's one industry to help another industry, quite simply. Ironically, this morning while I've been on this call, our fleet manager has come on to us and talk about that we need to start considering a lot more commercial vehicles, but we obviously have the issues of coverage and charging and things like that. So something as simple as that from our side. We know we can't do much at this moment in time until the actual car industry improves itself as first, and also the infrastructure to charge it.
Yeah. So I think I think it's right, Simon. So the big answer is obviously decarbonising your fleet completely. So moving to electric might be hard, you know, other technologies, but that, like I mentioned earlier, Phil, that may not be till. Now I'm just going to use 2035 for example. that may not be to the next replacement cycle. So you'd put in your carbon report, you've looked at your fleet. It's not practical to do the change at the moment, but you will look at it. And then, it could be even things like driver training, van sharing, looking at just the efficiency of your routing. It's all those things, because ultimately what net zero relies on is everybody doing lots of things slightly better. So it may not be that you can focus on the really big thing, because that will sit in the strategic change I was talking about, but you may be able to do something about your waste policy. You maybe do employee engagement. And again, I'm sure Simon will reiterate this, getting your staff to understand you're on a plan and you've got a plan, and getting all your staff to, and everyone thinks these are silly things, but turning lights off, putting waste in the right, all of those things. We need 8 to 10 billion people in the world eventually to do lots of things slightly better for net zero to really work. So it's about education, it's about engagement. And the first year or two may just be about that. It may just be about engaging. The other thing I would say, Phil, is, and Simon's a great example of this today, persuading others to think about this and make it is a really important element. We need momentum in this space for people to realize that this is the right thing to do, but also say, just from a business point of view, it makes really good business sense to do this. So actually switching your fleet, maybe that longer term strategic thing, while you do all of these smaller elements in the meantime. I hope that's asked a question. But if you want to, conversation a bit more, and maybe we can look to Mia to put some, tips and hints somewhere.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, we're with this webinar and, we're opening up the communication and we're trying to really bring it to everyone's attention that, this is stuff that you need to be aware of, even if, it's not necessarily top of your agenda, it's going to have to be at some point. So yeah, that's kind of just the message that we want to put out there. I think we will be working on more kind of guidance and more initiatives and more kind of plans about how we can make sure that our members have got all of the information that they need in order to be able to comply with this, with the net zero information. So yeah, there is one more. I don't know, David and Chris, do you have access to the question and answer boxes? Can you see Adrian's message there? Do you want to?
Yeah, I think it's just, again, Adrian's put in his last point. So it's an ambition to be net zero, and that's for it's for the public sector net zero, not Wales as a whole. And my understanding again is it's scope 1 and 2. So it's the operational carbon that they are in charge of. It's a bit like Evergreen. So for the NHS want to be operationally net zero by 2040, and then overall net zero by 2045. So sometimes you may see these different targets set, and really what that means is net zero scope 1 and 2 by 2040 or 2030 in this case, and then overall 2045, because you're relying on supply chain technology, but yeah, and this is where I can understand why people get confused, if I'm honest with you, because the language is sometimes quite confusing and different targets. And I go back to my very early point about what we're trying to do in the Carbon Accounting Alliance is bring those standardized approaches and language in so that everyone's talking about the same thing. But ultimately, I'll just reiterate, net zero is good for your business. Having a net zero strategy it's going to be essential, but we can give you lots of examples of companies we work that are winning tenders, winning awards because they've got a net zero plan in place, and therefore you're ahead of everyone having to do it. And we talk very much about the culture of decarbonisation rather than the compliance, bringing it and embedded it. Like say, this is going to go through the same sort of safety did many years ago. I remember, safety in the early 90s, it was the bloke in the high vis jacket who was responsible, and everyone had to sign a memo book, and you had to get consultants in. This is going to go through that same, where we don't have, don't really need to have someone talk about, we don't give head of safety awards at events, but we still give sustainability ones. That will go away because we're just going to mature as this grows.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Are there any more questions? Any final questions for David and Chris or Simon? And I mean, if you have any questions kind of that you think of afterwards, don't hesitate to get in touch, and we can pass them on, and we can definitely get some answers for you. Again, you can contact David and Chris directly at Net Zero if you'd like to. But yeah, I think we're making excellent time in. It's very good. We've got some another upcoming webinars to be aware of. We've got one on market insights and one on insurance. So if you'd like to book onto these, if you enjoyed this one, then go and have a look at our website, our events page. You can book on there. We've also got our Heritage and Traditional Build conference, which is in September in London. So again, go and have a look on our website for some more information, and then also the top 100 most influential women in construction. That's going to be held also in September. It's a busy month in September. And then we've got the Construction Awards of Excellence in November. So again, just go and have a look over at our website, and there are loads of events and webinars coming up, and there'll be kind of some more things coming your way. So I think that's everything. If there are any more final questions from the audience, I don't think so. I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you ever so much, David and Chris and Simon, for your insightful presentations. I think it's really beneficial to members to be aware about what's coming. So thank you ever so much. And thank you everyone for joining. I appreciate you taking the time to join us today. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.